Behind Britain's palace walls lived rulers whose obsessive collecting transformed rooms into overwhelming archives. Tonight, we explored 28 royals whose hoarding revealed something deeper about power and the human need to hold on. From queens who filled entire wings to kings whose collections consumed their lives, these stories uncover the psychology behind crowns that couldn't let go. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Dim the lights, settle in, and let the pace slow. Feel free to comment where you're listening from. Is it early in the evening in Glasgow, middle of the night in New York, or somewhere in between? We greatly appreciate your company during these quiet hours. Now let's begin. Number 1. King George IV, the king who couldn't walk through his rooms. Imagine walking into Carlton House and finding rooms you literally cannot enter. Not because they're locked, but because they're completely filled with furniture stacked to the ceiling. This was King George IV's reality. And it wasn't an accident. It was a lifestyle. George accumulated possessions with an intensity that shocked even his contemporaries. He ordered furniture sets in multiples, purchasing entire collections from craftsmen and storing them unused. His clothing collection spanned thousands of items, many worn once or never at all. Coats, breeches, stockings, and accessories filled wardrobes across multiple residences. Historical records show he kept detailed inventories of everything, yet continued acquiring more. His art collection grew beyond any reasonable display capacity. Paintings arrived faster than they could be hung. Sculptures occupied hallways because galleries overflowed. Decorative objects, clocks, vases, ornamental pieces, accumulated in such quantities that servants struggled to dust them all. The Royal Pavilion at Brighton became a monument to excess, every surface decorated, every room crammed with treasures fighting for attention. What made George's hoarding remarkable wasn't just volume, but the emotional attachment. He refused to part with gifts, even those from people who'd fallen from favour. He kept furniture from failed decorating schemes, rather than selling it. Each object represented a moment, a feeling, an aspiration he couldn't release. His debts mounted astronomically, yet he continued purchasing. Parliament would settle his accounts, and within months, he'd accumulated new debts, acquiring more possessions. The cycle repeated throughout his life. When he died, the task of cataloguing his belongings took years. Carlton House alone required months to clear. George's apartments told a story of someone trying to fill an internal void with external things, surrounding himself with beauty and luxury, as if enough objects might finally bring satisfaction they never could. Number 2. Queen Mary of Tech, the queen who kept everything. Queen Mary operated under a simple principle: nothing royal should ever be discarded. Ever. This wasn't sentiment, it was methodology. She transformed retention into an art form, creating an elaborate system for preserving, cataloguing, and redistributing royal possessions across generations. Walking through any residence Mary occupied meant encountering organized accumulation. Jewelry passed down through centuries sat in careful arrangements. Letters from long-dead relatives filled organized boxes. Furniture that hadn't been used in decades remained perfectly maintained, waiting for the moment it might be needed again. She believed every object connected to monarchy carried historical weight that transcended personal preference. Her famous raiding of relatives' homes became legendary. She'd visit aristocratic houses and admire pieces she believed belonged in royal collections. Her admiration functioned as acquisition. Few could refuse a queen's appreciation. These weren't thefts, but strategic accumulation, bringing scattered royal artifacts back under crown control. She saw herself as curator of monarchical heritage, preventing precious items from disappearing into private collections. Mary's cataloguing system rivaled professional museums. She knew what she owned, where it was stored, and its historical significance. When one palace filled, she'd redistribute items to another, creating an intricate network of stored possessions across royal properties. Nothing was forgotten. Everything maintained its place in her mental inventory. Her grandchildren inherited this philosophy unevenly. Elizabeth II absorbed the preservation instinct, maintaining collections with similar care. Others found Mary's retention excessive, preferring selective keeping over comprehensive preservation. But Mary never wavered. Royal possessions were national heritage, and her duty was ensuring nothing was lost to carelessness or changing fashions. After her death, discovering the full extent of her collections took considerable time. Rooms in various royal residences held carefully stored items she'd preserved decades earlier, each piece tagged and catalogued, waiting for someone who might need them. Number 3. King Henry VIII. The king who hoarded power in gold and armour. Henry VIII didn't just live lavishly, he accumulated obsessively, filling palaces with possessions that reflected his evolving image, his fears, and his desperate need to project power through material wealth. The inventories surviving from his reign reveal staggering quantities of objects, many never used, simply owned. His armour collection alone numbered in the hundreds. Suits designed for tournaments he never attended, ceremonial pieces created for events that never occurred, practical armour updated constantly as his body changed. Each suit represented a version of Henry: young athlete, mature warrior, aging king, preserved in steel and decoration. He couldn't discard earlier armour because doing so meant acknowledging time's passage. Tapestries covered miles of wall space across his properties. Some depicted biblical scenes, others classical history or hunting tableau. He moved them between palaces based on season and occasion, but never disposed of any. They represented wealth, yes, but also permanence. Unlike political alliances or personal relationships, tapestries didn't betray him. His clothing inventories reveal thousands of items. Doublets, gowns, cloaks, nightshirts, gloves, hats, all stored carefully even when fashion moved on. Historical records show extensive lists of jeweled accessories, decorative weapons, religious relics, and luxury goods. He hoarded books despite his deteriorating eyesight, musical instruments despite playing less frequently, gifts from foreign dignitaries decades after those relationships soured. The dissolution of the monasteries wasn't just religious reform. It was the greatest acquisition spree in English history. Monastic treasures, libraries, and wealth flowed to the crown, and Henry kept much of it. Gold plate, jeweled crosses, illuminated manuscripts filled his treasuries. Each item proved his supremacy over the church that had once constrained him. After his death, inventorying his possessions required massive effort. The sheer volume of accumulated objects across dozens of properties revealed a man who believed possession equaled power, who surrounded himself with things because people proved unreliable. Number 4. Queen Victoria, the queen who froze in time. When Prince Albert died in December 1861, time stopped at Windsor Castle. Victoria didn't just preserve his memory, she preserved everything. His rooms remained exactly as he'd left them. His clothes stayed in their wardrobes. His papers sat on his desk. For 40 years, servants prepared these rooms daily as if he might return, maintaining spaces frozen in 1861. But Albert's rooms were just the beginning. Victoria kept everything connected to him. Letters they'd exchanged, gifts he'd given her, objects he'd touched. She wore mourning jewellery containing his hair. She commissioned photographs, paintings, and sculptures to capture his image. Her bedroom held his portrait, where she could see it constantly. She slept beside a photograph of him on his deathbed, maintaining connection even in sleep. This preservation extended beyond Albert to her entire life. Victoria kept clothing from decades past, stored but never discarded. Rooms at Windsor, Balmoral, and Osborne House filled with possessions accumulated over 63 years. Letters from childhood friends, gifts from foreign leaders, mementos from state occasions. Everything received a place and stayed there. Her diaries represented perhaps the ultimate act of retention. Daily records spanning most of her life, preserving not just events, but thoughts, feelings, and observations. She created a written archive of her existence, ensuring nothing would be forgotten. Later, editors condensed and excerpted, but Victoria's original impulse was comprehensive preservation. This hoarding served psychological purposes. Each object anchored her to happier times before Albert's death, before age and loss accumulated. The rooms at Windsor weren't shrines. They were time machines, spaces where the past remained accessible through careful maintenance of its material traces. Her children and grandchildren inherited palaces full of Victorian accumulation. Sorting her possessions after her death revealed the scale of retention across decades, showing how one person's refusal to discard creates work for generations. Number 5. King Charles II, the king who hoarded science. Charles II's apartments at Whitehall resembled a gentleman's scientific laboratory more than royal chambers. Instruments crowded every surface: telescopes, microscopes, barometers, clocks in various stages of disassembly. He collected apparatus obsessively, acquiring each new invention or improvement the moment it became available. His fascination with how things worked meant he couldn't simply own them. He had to keep them all. His library reflected similar accumulation patterns. Books on natural philosophy, mathematics, mechanics, and chemistry filled shelves and spilled onto tables. He annotated extensively, creating personal copies that became unique objects he couldn't discard. First editions mixed with technical manuals, classical texts sat beside contemporary scientific papers. The collection grew organically, driven by curiosity rather than systematic building. Charles kept experimental devices long after he'd finished investigating their principles. Glass vessels from chemical experiments, mechanical models demonstrating physical laws, botanical specimens in preservation. Each represented a moment of discovery he couldn't release. His rooms told the story of his intellectual journey through their accumulated artifacts. His interest in clocks and watches became legendary. He owned dozens, constantly acquiring new timepieces featuring different mechanisms or improvements. He'd take them apart to understand their workings, then keep both the intact pieces and the mechanisms he'd examined. Time fascinated him practically and philosophically, and he collected its measurement devices as others collected art. Friends and courtiers enabled this hoarding by gifting scientific instruments, knowing Charles's interests. Each present joined the growing collection, valued for its donor and its function. He maintained correspondence with European scientists, and many sent him specimens, instruments, or books that he carefully preserved. The Royal Society benefited from Charles's accumulation instincts. Items he'd studied often found their way to the Society's collections, though only after he'd thoroughly investigated them himself. His personal hoarding served scientific advancement, preserving instruments and knowledge for future scholars while satisfying his immediate curiosity. Number 6. Prince Albert. The prince who collected progress. Prince Albert didn't just acquire objects, he acquired ideas, systems, and innovations, storing them in physical form across royal residences. His collections represented Victorian progress itself, preserved in art, architectural plans, inventions, and educational materials that accumulated faster than they could be properly displayed or utilized. His artistic acquisitions filled galleries and storage rooms alike. Early Renaissance paintings, contemporary works, sketches and drawings. Albert believed in comprehensive collection building. He didn't just buy masterpieces, he purchased entire bodies of work, wanting context and progression rather than isolated highlights. Many pieces never hung in public spaces but remained carefully stored, waiting for the museum-quality display he envisioned. Architectural plans and models consumed entire rooms. Albert involved himself deeply in building projects, and each generated drawings, models, and correspondence he preserved meticulously. The plans for Osborne House, Balmoral Castle, and various improvements to royal properties existed in multiple versions, each revision saved rather than discarded. He treated architectural development as historical record requiring complete documentation. His educational materials reflected his belief in self-improvement and public enlightenment. Books on every subject imaginable, scientific instruments, mechanical models demonstrating principles of physics and engineering. He collected teaching tools obsessively. The Great Exhibition of 1851 grew partly from his personal collection instincts, creating a temporary museum of human achievement that mirrored his permanent private accumulation. Inventions particularly fascinated him. Working models of new technologies, patent drawings, correspondence with inventors. Albert preserved innovations even when they proved impractical. Each represented human ingenuity worth documenting. His offices filled with these materials, organized by subject but overwhelming in volume. After his death, Victoria preserved Albert's collections as he'd left them, adding his accumulation patterns to her own. The combined effect created rooms that functioned as time capsules of Victorian intellectual life, showing not just what they valued, but how they thought about knowledge, progress, and the duty to preserve human achievement. Number 7. King Edward VII, the king whose wardrobes never closed. Edward VII's clothing collection bordered on pathological. He owned hundreds of suits, thousands of shirts, endless accessories, and maintained multiple complete wardrobes across his various residences. But unlike his father, George IV's indiscriminate accumulation, Edward's hoarding had method. He simply refused to discard anything once acquired, regardless of fashion changes or practical utility. His daily routine required multiple outfit changes, and each outfit accumulated rather than cycled out. Morning wear, afternoon suits, evening dress, sporting clothes, military uniforms. Edward maintained complete sets of everything in every location he frequented. Sandringham, Balmoral, Windsor, Buckingham Palace, Marlborough House, each held wardrobes spanning decades of his adult life. What made this hoarding remarkable was its completeness. He didn't just keep the garments, but all accessories. Hundreds of pairs of shoes, drawers full of gloves sorted by occasion and colour, ties and cravats in quantities no single person could wear in years. His hat collection alone required dedicated storage. Walking sticks, canes and umbrellas filled stands in multiple residences. Gifts from foreign visits accumulated relentlessly. Each state occasion generated ceremonial garments, decorations, and accessories he felt obligated to preserve. His rooms filled with elaborate uniforms worn once for photographs, then carefully stored against future need that rarely materialized. He maintained complete diplomatic wardrobes for countries he might never visit again. His sporting clothes reflected similar patterns. Hunting at different estates required appropriate attire for each, and he maintained these wardrobes separately. Yachting gear, riding clothes, shooting suits. Each activity generated its own collection that grew with each season, rather than replacing previous year's items. Servants managed this accumulation through elaborate organizational systems, but even their efficiency couldn't prevent overflow. Storage rooms filled with carefully labeled boxes and garment bags, creating archives of Edwardian fashion that documented not just Edward's tastes, but the evolution of men's clothing across his lifetime. Number 8. King George III, the king who built libraries in every room. George III didn't collect books. He accumulated knowledge obsessively, creating personal libraries that eventually filled entire sections of royal residences. His collecting transcended bibliomania into something approaching information hoarding, where the physical presence of books mattered as much as their content. His primary library grew systematically. He commissioned agents to purchase entire collections when they became available. absorbing private libraries into his own. First editions, rare manuscripts, scientific texts, classical works. George wanted comprehensive coverage of human knowledge. He didn't just acquire highlights, but complete runs of publications, entire bodies of authors' works, every edition showing textual evolution. What distinguished George's hoarding was his genuine engagement with the material. Unlike collectors who treat books as objects, George read extensively, annotated copies, and maintained detailed catalogues. Yet his acquisition rate far exceeded his reading capacity, creating accumulation despite active use. He'd finish one book and have dozens more waiting, their very presence somehow satisfying even unread. Scientific and mathematical texts particularly attracted him. He corresponded with scholars, and these relationships generated gifts of books and manuscripts that joined his collections. His interest in astronomy meant acquiring not just texts, but star charts, astronomical tables, and observational records that filled specialized storage. Maps and atlases accumulated similarly. Geographic knowledge fascinated George, and he built comprehensive cartographic collections showing political boundaries, exploration routes, and territorial changes. These materials served both intellectual interest and practical statecraft, but the volume exceeded any practical need, revealing collecting impulse beyond utility. His illness later in life meant he could no longer read effectively, yet the collections continued growing. His sons purchased books on his behalf, maintaining the accumulation even as George's ability to engage with them deteriorated. The libraries became monuments to his earlier intellectual vigor, preserved and expanded as if reading might somehow resume. After his death, his library formed the foundation of the British Library's collection. 65,000 volumes transferred to the nation, revealing the scale of his accumulation and ensuring his hoarding served lasting educational purpose. Number 9. Queen Elizabeth I, the Queen who never threw anything away. Elizabeth I transformed retention into political strategy, but beneath the calculated preservation of symbolic objects lay genuine hoarding behaviour. She kept everything: clothing decades out of fashion, broken jewellery awaiting repair that never came, gifts from courtiers long dead, letters from suitors she'd rejected. Her private chambers told stories through accumulated objects that she couldn't or wouldn't release. Her wardrobe became legendary for its excess. Thousands of gowns, each heavily decorated with jewels, embroidery, and precious metals. She wore these garments once or twice, then stored them. Fashion evolved, styles changed, but Elizabeth kept every piece. Her reasoning mixed practical consideration. The gowns represented enormous wealth in materials and craftsmanship, with emotional attachment. Each dress connected to specific occasions, performances of majesty she delivered while wearing them. Wigs accumulated similarly. As she aged and her hair thinned, she relied increasingly on elaborate hairpieces. Rather than replacing old wigs with new ones, she added to the collection continuously. Storage rooms held wigs in various styles and colours, many never worn again after their initial use, but preserved against uncertain future need. Jewellery hoarding extended beyond crowns and state regalia to personal ornaments. Broken pieces awaiting repair, unfashionable items from earlier decades, gifts from foreign ambassadors, everything stayed. She maintained detailed inventories, knowing what she owned and where it was stored, but this organisation existed alongside reluctance to discard anything once acquired. Her collection of personal letters and documents created its own archival burden. Correspondence from her long reign filled chests and cabinets. She saved letters from subjects, foreign rulers, and favourites, creating an enormous paper trail that chronicled her relationships and reign. These weren't official state papers, but personal communications she couldn't bring herself to destroy. The accumulation reflected control issues fundamental to her character. Discarding objects meant losing control over them, acknowledging they no longer served purpose. Elizabeth's entire reign involved maintaining control through careful management of appearances and relationships. Her hoarding extended this impulse to material possessions, keeping everything because releasing anything felt like weakness. Number 10. King James I. The king buried in books and papers. James I arrived in England with considerable intellectual reputation, but his scholarly interests quickly transformed into compulsive accumulation. His private chambers became labyrinths of books, manuscripts, and papers that multiplied faster than any organizational system could manage. Servants navigated carefully through stacks that threatened to topple with each passing. His book collecting lacked the systematic approach of later royal bibliophiles. James acquired volumes impulsively, drawn to theology, political theory, witchcraft, and classical literature without discrimination. Gifts from scholars and courtiers seeking favor added to the chaos. Each book represented knowledge he intended to engage with eventually, but the backlog grew continuously. Unread volumes accumulated alongside those he'd studied thoroughly. Manuscripts and papers created particular disorder. James wrote extensively, theological treatises, political tracts, poetry, and kept every draft, revision, and abandoned project. His correspondence filled chests without clear organization. Letters from European monarchs mixed with petitions from subjects and notes from advisors. The paper trail of his reign accumulated in his personal spaces rather than proper archives. His gift hoarding compounded the problem. Courtiers presented elaborate offerings hoping for royal favor, and James accepted everything without discarding anything. Decorative objects, curiosities, exotic items from distant lands. They all found places in his overcrowded rooms. Each gift carried the donor's identity, making disposal feel like rejection of the relationship itself. Religious texts particularly accumulated. James's interest in theology meant acquiring multiple copies of important works, different translations, commentaries, and critiques. His sponsorship of the King James Bible generated preliminary materials, draft translations, and scholarly correspondence that he preserved completely. The project's papers alone filled considerable space. His hunting lodges and secondary residences suffered similar accumulation. James moved between properties regularly, but instead of maintaining each separately, he transported materials with him or left them scattered across locations. This created multiple sites of disorder rather than one manageable collection. The clutter reflected his intellectual restlessness. James's mind moved quickly between subjects, starting projects he didn't finish, acquiring materials for studies he never completed. The physical accumulation mirrored his mental pattern. Everything seemed important in the moment of acquisition, but follow-through rarely matched initial enthusiasm. Number 11. Queen Alexandra, the queen who couldn't let go. Queen Alexandra's hoarding centered on sentiment. Unlike collectors driven by aesthetic judgment or systematic completeness, she kept things because of emotional connections she couldn't sever. Her rooms filled with objects that others would have discarded decades earlier, each one anchoring her to memories she refused to release. Her clothing retention was extreme, even by royal standards. Dresses from her youth as Princess of Wales remained carefully stored into her 70s. She couldn't wear them anymore. Fashion had changed. Her figure had changed, but she couldn't discard them either. Each gown connected to specific occasions, feelings, moments of happiness she could revisit by touching the fabric. Her wardrobes held complete chronologies of her life in textile form. Letters and correspondence accumulated in enormous quantities. Alexandra saved everything: formal communications, personal notes, birthday cards, telegrams. She organized them initially, but eventually just stored them in boxes and trunks, as volume overwhelmed system. Reading old letters became a form of comfort, reconnecting her with relationships and times that had passed. Photographs created another category of accumulation. Alexandra lived through photography's evolution from rare novelty to common practice, and she documented everything. family photos, official portraits, casual snapshots. She kept them all, often in multiple copies. Her photo albums and loose collections filled rooms, creating visual archives of her entire life. Sentimental objects from her children's lives remained throughout their adulthood. Toys they'd outgrown, their childhood clothing, schoolwork and drawings. Alexandra preserved it all. Motherhood defined much of her identity, and these objects kept childhood present, even as her children aged. She couldn't bear to acknowledge time's passage by discarding its traces. Her deafness, which worsened throughout her life, may have intensified her hoarding. As auditory connection to the world diminished, physical objects became more important. They provided tangible connection to past and present that didn't depend on hearing conversations or music. Each object could be held, examined, remembered, without requiring sound. After Edward VII's death, Alexandra's retention intensified. She kept his rooms largely unchanged, adding his possessions to her own accumulation patterns. The overlap created spaces so densely packed with meaning that servants struggled to clean effectively. Every surface held something precious, something that couldn't be moved or disturbed. Number 12. King Edward VIII. The Duke who hoarded his lost kingdom. After abdication, Edward VIII became the Duke of Windsor, but he never stopped accumulating the trappings of the kingship he'd surrendered. His homes in France filled with royal memorabilia, uniforms he'd never wear again, and furniture from his brief reign. He hoarded the physical remnants of monarchy as if possessing them might somehow restore what he'd lost. His uniform collection was particularly poignant. Military dress from his time as Prince of Wales and King, ceremonial garments from state occasions, orders and decorations from his royal role. He kept everything. These uniforms no longer fit his official status. He couldn't wear them publicly without causing constitutional awkwardness, yet he maintained them perfectly, having them cleaned and stored as if he might need them tomorrow. Furniture from Fort Belvedere and other royal residences followed him into exile. Pieces he'd used during his kingship, items connected to his life with Wallis Simpson before abdication. He refused to leave them behind or sell them, despite sometimes constrained finances. Each piece validated his identity as someone who'd been king, tangible proof against the erasure he feared. His correspondence and papers accumulated obsessively. Edward saved every letter, every document, every scrap of paper connected to the abdication crisis. He intended to write his version of events, to justify his choices through careful presentation of evidence. The materials for this project filled rooms, though the definitive account he envisioned never quite materialized as planned. Photographs and newsreels documenting his earlier life received careful preservation. Images of him as popular Prince of Wales, touring industrial areas, visiting war veterans, projecting modern accessible royalty. These contrasted painfully with his later marginalized status. Yet he kept them, perhaps hoping posterity would remember the promise rather than the abdication. Gifts from his royal years created awkward accumulation. Items from foreign leaders, presentations from British organizations, mementos from state visits. These belonged to the King Edward VIII who no longer existed, yet the Duke of Windsor couldn't discard them. They represented the only kingship he'd known, brief but real. His hoarding revealed deeper issues with identity and loss. Having surrendered the throne for love, he spent decades surrounded by physical reminders of what he'd given up, unable to fully embrace his new status or completely release his old one. Number 13. Queen Charlotte, the queen who orchestrated clutter. Queen Charlotte's accumulation centered on her passions, music, art, and the elaborate social machinery of court life. Her collections served genuine interests, but her inability to curate meant everything accumulated rather than cycling through active use into dignified retirement or disposal. Her music collection overwhelmed dedicated rooms, scores for keyboard, compositions for royal entertainments, teaching materials for her 15 children, Charlotte saved everything. She played competently and encouraged musical education, but the physical materials multiplied beyond any practical library. Multiple copies of the same works, outdated arrangements, pieces too difficult or too simple, all retained their places on overstuffed shelves. Musical instruments presented similar challenges. Harpsichords, early pianos, smaller instruments for children's use. She kept them all even as the new acquisitions arrived. Some needed repair but remained in storage awaiting attention that never came. Others simply became obsolete as musical technology evolved. Yet Charlotte couldn't bring herself to dispose of instruments that had once made music in her household. Her art collecting followed contemporary aristocratic patterns but exceeded reasonable display capacity. Paintings, drawings, decorative objects she acquired steadily throughout her long marriage to George III. Some pieces had genuine value, others were merely pleasant. She treated them equally, finding wall space or storage for everything without discriminating based on quality. Court life generated its own accumulation. Elaborate gowns for drawing rooms and state occasions, decorative objects used for specific events, correspondence with the vast network of European royalty she maintained. Charlotte preserved it all. Each item connected to her role as queen and her German heritage, making disposal feel like abandoning duty or identity. Her botanical interests added another layer. She patronized botanical illustration and collected botanical texts, pressed flowers, and specimens. Kew Gardens benefited from her support, but her personal collections also grew, creating natural history archives in her private apartments. The sheer scale of managing a large family contributed to accumulation. 15 children generated enormous quantities of belongings, and Charlotte's maternal attachment meant preserving mementos from each childhood. Multiply normal parental sentiment by 15, and the volume becomes staggering. After George III's illness removed him from active life, Charlotte's collections took on memorial quality. Objects connected to their earlier happy years together gained importance. She couldn't discard things that reminded her of better times, adding grief-driven retention to her existing accumulation patterns. Number 14. Princess Margaret. The princess lost in her collections. Princess Margaret's hoarding reflected her complicated position, royal but not sovereign, privileged but constrained, famous but frustrated. Her accumulation of clothing, letters, gifts, and personal items created chaos across her residences that mirrored the disorder of her own conflicted identity. Her clothing collection rivaled her mother's, though with different character. Margaret followed fashion obsessively, acquiring pieces from top designers each season, but she didn't discard previous seasons' wardrobes. Dresses from the 1950s remained stored alongside 70s and 80s acquisitions. Her closets told the story of changing fashion, but also of inability to release any chapter of her life. The Kensington Palace apartment she occupied for decades filled gradually with accumulated possessions. Initial elegant arrangements gave way to crowded surfaces and overstuffed storage. Gifts from admirers and friends, souvenirs from travels, decorative objects she'd purchased impulsively. Everything found a place and stayed there. The accumulation made the apartment feel smaller each year. Her correspondence created particular chaos. Margaret maintained extensive social networks, and this generated continuous paper flow, letters from friends, invitations, programs from events she'd attended. She saved these materials without clear organization, creating boxes and stacks that documented her social life but overwhelmed any filing system. Photographs accumulated similarly. Margaret loved being photographed and collected images of herself from throughout her life. Professional portraits, casual snapshots, photos from holidays and official events. She kept them all, often in multiple copies. This created a visual archive of her existence that she couldn't bear to edit or reduce. Her drinking and smoking paraphernalia became collectibles themselves. decorative cigarette cases, elaborate lighters, crystal glasses and decanters. These objects served daily use, but also accumulated as she acquired new versions without discarding old ones. They represented her defiant lifestyle choices, her rejection of conventional royal propriety. The possessions of her broken relationships caused particular hoarding complications. Items connected to Peter Townsend, to Tony Armstrong-Jones during their marriage and after divorce. She couldn't discard them, despite the pain they represented. Each object held memories she simultaneously wanted to preserve and escape. Her hoarding intensified with age and illness. As her health declined and her world contracted, physical possessions became more important. They provided continuity and comfort, tangible connections to the full life she'd lived when younger. Number 15. King William IV. The sailor king who never left the Navy behind. William IV spent decades in naval service before unexpectedly inheriting the throne at age 64. He brought the Navy with him, not just memories and experience, but physical accumulation of his maritime life that filled his royal residences with nautical artifacts that seemed increasingly incongruous with his kingly status. His uniform collection was extensive and carefully maintained. Every rank he'd held, every ship he'd served on generated uniforms and associated equipment that he preserved. Even as king, he kept his admiral's uniforms in pristine condition, occasionally wearing them for naval events rather than royal regalia. The clothes connected him to his truest identity, not king but sailor. Naval equipment and artifacts accumulated throughout his life. Navigation instruments, ship models, maritime charts, logs from vessels he'd commanded. William saved everything connected to his naval career. These items held pride of place in his private rooms, creating spaces that felt more like a captain's quarters than a king's chambers. His correspondence with naval colleagues continued throughout his reign, and he saved every letter. These communications allowed him to maintain connection with the service that had defined most of his life. Reading updates from active officers let him vicariously continue the career his crown had ended. The letters accumulated in dedicated storage, organized more carefully than his official royal correspondence. Gifts from his naval years presented interesting hoarding dynamics. Presentation swords, commemorative items, souvenirs from ports visited, each connected to specific experiences and relationships forged at sea. As king, he received more elaborate gifts, but the naval mementos retained special significance that prevented their relegation to storage or disposal. His ship models deserved particular mention. William commissioned detailed models of vessels he'd served on and ships that interested him technically. These weren't decorative objects, but teaching tools and reminders, each one prompting memories of specific voyages and experiences. They filled display cases and shelves, creating miniature fleets throughout his residences. The accumulation reflected identity confusion. William had never expected to be king. His naval career represented his chosen life, interrupted by duty when his older brother died childless. Surrounded by naval artifacts, he could briefly forget the crown and remember the younger man who'd found purpose and happiness at sea. Number 16. Queen Anne. The queen who kept court in storage. Queen Anne's hoarding was quieter than some predecessors, but no less pervasive. Across her multiple residences, she accumulated the material culture of court life: furniture, linens, tableware, decorative items, anything connected to her role as queen and the elaborate household she maintained, even amid frequent illness and personal tragedy. Replaced objects were rarely discarded. Worn or outdated items went into storage, creating vast reserves of superseded goods. Her personal possessions reflected profound grief. Anne endured 17 pregnancies, losing all but one child, who died at 11. She preserved mementos from each pregnancy and child: clothing, toys, remembrances. objects that filled her private spaces and provided solace during bouts of ill health. Correspondence and papers also accumulated. Navigating the intense party politics of Whigs and Tories, Anne received constant communications from ministers and politicians. She saved these letters, building records of policy debates, appeals, and alliances that shaped her reign. Religious objects held deep significance. Her Anglican faith inspired accumulation of devotional items, texts, and church-related materials. These were not mere possessions, but tools of spiritual practice, carefully preserved alongside her growing theological library. Gifts from courtiers and diplomats created further hoarding challenges. Refusing presents could offend, but keeping all of them expanded storage demands. Anne accepted everything, displayed selectively, and stored the rest, maintaining a memory of donors alongside the objects themselves. Physical limitations intensified her attachment. Gout and obesity eventually confined her mobility, contracting her world to reachable spaces. Within them, possessions became companions, providing comfort and occupation. Her accumulation also reflected her transitional monarchy. As the last Stuart ruler and a constitutional queen, Anne's possessions bridged dynastic continuity and parliamentary power. Each object validated an aspect of her identity, creating an enduring archive of her reign, grief, faith, and royal responsibility. Number 17. King George V, the king who preserved empire in miniature. George V's hoarding revolved around his roles as naval officer, emperor, and custodian of British power. He accumulated uniforms, medals, ceremonial objects, stamps, and imperial memorabilia, preserving the material culture of empire, even as its influence waned. His uniform collection was meticulous. Each military rank, ceremonial occasion, and order of chivalry generated specific dress, all carefully preserved. Unlike his father Edward VII's indiscriminate hoarding, George's uniforms were systematically catalogued, yet their sheer volume filled dedicated wardrobe rooms across his residences. Medals and decorations accumulated continuously. Honours from Britain and abroad were kept organised by nation and occasion, displayed in cases that documented diplomatic relationships. Each medal marked a state event or maintained a ceremonial network binding the empire together. George's philately reflected both thoroughness and passion. He built comprehensive stamp collections representing territories under British influence, communications networks, and imperial reach. While enormously valuable, his attachment was emotional rather than financial. Imperial memorabilia and gifts from dominions and colonies found permanent homes in his collections, making Britain's vast empire tangible through objects. Naval artifacts from his early career, ship models, navigation instruments, and vessel memorabilia maintained his lifelong connection to the Navy. Papers and correspondence were equally preserved. Official communications, personal letters, and daily diaries chronicled his adult life in exhaustive detail, creating an unparalleled archive of his perspective. World War I intensified his accumulation. Photographs, letters from soldiers, maps, and war-related objects filled his archives, each item representing sacrifice he felt duty-bound to honour. Through meticulous preservation, George V transformed the material culture of monarchy and empire into a comprehensive record of duty, identity, and imperial legacy. Number 18. Queen Adelaide, the queen who stored kindness. Queen Adelaide's hoarding was gentle, reflecting a kind nature and careful thought rather than obsession. She preserved gifts returned to her, household items long past usefulness, correspondence documenting charitable work, and personal letters from friends and beneficiaries. These accumulations became quiet archives of her generosity, each item representing a connection she valued. Her charitable work generated significant accumulation. Those she helped sent letters, tokens, and updates. all of which Adelaide saved. Discarding them would have felt like dismissing the people she had aided. Household objects multiplied due to her frugality. Furniture, linens, and tools were kept for potential future use, filling storage spaces with practical items that might never be needed. Adelaide's role in raising William IV's illegitimate children added another layer. She kept mementos, letters, and gifts from them, preserving evidence of her maternal care despite having no children of her own. Religious objects, prayer books, devotional texts, and church-related items also accumulated, reflecting faith integrated into daily life. Gifts from Germany reminded her of her homeland, anchoring her identity before royalty. After William's death, Adelaide preserved his belongings alongside her own, quietly maintaining shared spaces. In widowhood, her possessions became companions, each object holding memory and meaning, sustaining a life rich in connection, kindness, and quiet devotion. Number 19. Queen Mary I, the Queen who hoarded the faith. Mary I's brief reign was dominated by a religious restoration, and her personal hoarding reflected that mission. She accumulated religious artifacts, ceremonial objects, and items tied to Catholic devotion with intensity that blended genuine faith and political strategy. Each piece validated her purpose, returning England to Rome. Her collection of relics grew steadily. Inherited items, objects reclaimed from Protestant destruction, and gifts from Catholic allies abroad formed a devotional and political arsenal. Each relic represented continuity with pre-Reformation England, proving the old faith remained now gathered home. Ceremonial vestments and church equipment accumulated as Mary sought to restore worship. Chalices, altar cloths, priestly vestments, and candelabras filled storage, awaiting distribution to churches. These items were both practical tools and symbols of her mission, tangible proof of restoration underway. Personal devotional objects also multiplied. Rosaries, prayer books, and images of saints surrounded Mary, sustaining her through political opposition and personal disappointment. These objects were not merely possessions, they were tools of daily faith, though amassed far beyond personal use. Items connected to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, were preserved carefully, objects validating Catherine's legitimacy, and Mary's own right to succession anchored her identity, serving as reminders of the struggles that shaped her early life. Gifts from Catholic allies, including Philip II of Spain and the Pope, added to her accumulation. Each carried political and symbolic weight, reinforcing alliances and her religious mission. Mary's hoarding extended to documents and correspondence. Records of heresy trials, letters to Rome, and church property registers created an archive of her work, proving the scope and legitimacy of her restoration efforts. Ultimately, Mary's accumulation reflected deep insecurity. Having spent decades uncertain of her status, she could not trust stability. Each artifact, vestment, letter, or relic became a tangible assertion of authority and faith. Her collections were both practical and symbolic, proof of devotion, power, and the persistence of the Catholic Church in England. Number 20. King Henry VII, the king who counted everything twice. Henry VII's hoarding reflected his obsession with control and security. Having seized the throne at Bosworth, he meticulously tracked wealth, records, and possessions to assert authority and protect his tenuous claim. His financial archives were extraordinary. Every expense, income, and debt was reviewed personally and recorded, creating a comprehensive paper trail that filled entire rooms. Precious objects, gold, silver, gems, and heirlooms served as liquid reserves rather than display. Each item's value was catalogued, yet rarely sold, emphasizing accumulation over consumption. Dynastic artifacts linking him to Tudor or Lancastrian heritage reinforced his legitimacy, while land deeds, feudal claims, and bonds from nobles created a web of administrative power. When he died, his will revealed a life systematically catalogued and safeguarded. Each jewel, plate, and document represented more than wealth. It was security against political uncertainty. Henry's hoarding was a methodical defensive act designed to quantify and stabilize his world in ways only meticulous accounting and careful preservation could achieve. Number 21. Queen Caroline of Brunswick, the exiled queen who clutched at home. Exiled from England and shunned by George IV, Caroline of Brunswick hoarded to preserve identity and stability. Travelling across Europe, she filled rented villas with personal belongings she refused to discard. Clothing from her youth sat alongside eccentric later outfits, reflecting both memory and defiance. Letters from supporters, European nobility, and her late daughter Princess Charlotte became precious evidence of her continued relevance. Gifts, court mementos, and objects validating her royal status were similarly preserved, physical proof of legitimacy amid rejection. Her hoarding mirrored her desperate need for recognition. Attempts to attend George's coronation failed, but her collections testified to her refusal to vanish from royal life. Caroline's possessions chronicled resilience. Each item represented memory, identity, and defiance against a life increasingly constrained by exile. Number 22. King George II, the king who let things pile up. George II's hoarding was subtle but persistent, a byproduct of a long reign rather than obsessive intent. He rarely discarded anything, allowing possessions to accumulate naturally across his residences. Royal apartments grew cluttered with items reflecting his priorities. Military gear, gifts, papers, and furnishings collected without much order or planning. Military items formed a large part of his collection. As the last British monarch to lead troops in battle, George preserved uniforms, weapons, maps, and correspondence, piling them together rather than carefully curating them. Artworks arrived sporadically, added more for availability than vision. Paintings, prints, and sculptures filled storage and walls, but often lacked context or thematic cohesion. Furniture multiplied across palaces. Old pieces rarely discarded, new pieces added as needed. Correspondence and papers grew similarly, stacked in boxes and desks, creating functional yet chaotic archives. Personal effects, from gifts during travels to items tied to his German homeland, added layers to the accumulation. After Queen Caroline's death in 1737, George preserved her belongings, blending memorial remembrance with general accumulation. His possessions were a quiet reflection of life, lived long and actively, rather than deliberate hoarding. When he died suddenly in 1760, his grandson George III inherited decades of uncurated accumulation, a palace full of decades' worth of unintentional hoarding. Number 23. Queen Henrietta Maria, the queen who hoarded through catastrophe. Henrietta Maria's hoarding was driven by faith, identity, and survival amid political chaos. As a Catholic queen in Protestant England, she amassed religious objects, rosaries, relics, devotional texts, and images of saints, creating private spaces for worship. These items symbolized her faith and resistance in a court that often rejected her beliefs. Her art collection was equally political. Patronizing Catholic artists and acquiring religious works, Henrietta surrounded herself with objects that validated her faith while asserting cultural identity. During the English Civil War, her ability to preserve possessions was severely tested. She fled from place to place, insisting on traveling with as much as possible, refusing to part with items that reinforced her sense of normalcy and status. Exile in France intensified her attachment. Henrietta Maria preserved objects inherited from Charles I and kept carefully archived correspondence with loyal supporters in England, maintaining threads of connection and hope. After the Restoration, she attempted to reclaim lost possessions, demonstrating that her collections were more than wealth. They were extensions of her identity and her life with Charles. Henrietta Maria died in 1669, never fully replacing lost items but holding on to those she could, a queen defined by attachment to possessions amid upheaval. Number 24. Prince Albert, the prince who collected love and legacy. Prince Albert's hoarding reflected both intellect and devotion. As consort to Queen Victoria, he accumulated objects tied to family, innovation, and culture, seeking to preserve legacy as much as utility. His interests were wide-ranging: art, scientific instruments, architectural plans, and gifts from foreign dignitaries, all meticulously catalogued. Albert saw objects as extensions of his mind and heart. Each item validated achievement, taste, or affection. He preserved correspondence extensively. Letters from Victoria, European royalty, and political figures documented personal and professional networks, providing insight into his role in governance and family life. His personal gifts, books, art, and curiosities, were rarely discarded, creating rooms that doubled as private museums. Albert also hoarded symbols of innovation and industry. He championed exhibitions, patents, and designs, keeping models and prototypes of inventions that interested him. These objects reflected his belief in progress and the intellectual life of the monarchy. Even memorial items were accumulated. After his death, Victoria preserved his collections alongside her own, cementing the prince's presence in memory and palace spaces. Albert's careful collection blended affection, intellect, and duty into tangible form, creating a legacy that outlived him. Number 25. Victoria Eugenie, the queen who kept Spain in exile. Victoria Eugenie's life was marked by displacement and secrecy, and her accumulation mirrored this instability. As queen consort of Spain during politically turbulent times, she retained clothing, personal mementos, and gifts from family and foreign dignitaries. These objects became anchors of identity amid exile and court scandal. Jewelry and ceremonial objects were meticulously preserved. Each piece symbolized rank, duty, or connection to the European royal network, helping Victoria Eugenie maintain dignity in uncertain circumstances. She catalogued items carefully, sometimes traveling with them when moving residences, creating a mobile archive of personal and political significance. Correspondence formed a significant part of her hoarding. Letters from family, supporters, and political allies provided continuity and reassurance, preserving links to her past and asserting influence over her precarious position. Even everyday items carried meaning. Fans, gloves, and small personal effects became tokens of memory and stability, representing life in a court where public scrutiny often clashed with private comfort. Victoria Eugenie's hoarding reflected both personal resilience and the necessity of preserving identity in exile. Number 26. James II, the king who carried his throne to France. James II's hoarding was inseparable from his exile after the Glorious Revolution. Forced from England in 1688, he transported treasures, ceremonial objects, and documents to France, creating a portable court that maintained royal dignity in foreign lands. His accumulation was practical and symbolic. Objects validated authority and preserved continuity. Furniture, plate, and decorative objects travelled with him, filling French residences with the trappings of monarchy. Even minor items like clothing, writing implements, and ceremonial regalia were catalogued and preserved. Each object signified status and identity, a statement that exile had not erased his kingship. Correspondence and political documents formed a critical archive. Letters from supporters, legal claims to the throne, and records of estates provided leverage for potential restoration. He retained anything that reinforced legitimacy, often at the expense of space and comfort. James's hoarding reflected psychological needs as much as political ones. Objects became anchors in a dislocated life, material reminders of power heritage, and the court he was forced to leave behind. Number 27. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon. The Queen Mother who never discarded a gift. Elizabeth Bowes. Lyon's approach to hoarding combined sentimentality with prudence. The Queen Mother accumulated gifts, letters and objects associated with family state and personal history, rarely discarding anything. Each possession symbolized affection, duty, or memory, creating a vast personal archive. Gifts from family and political figures were preserved carefully, regardless of size or ostentation. She catalogued items in palace rooms, storing them even when their practical use had passed. Clothing, jewelry, and decorative objects often remained untouched for decades, testament to her deep emotional attachment. Correspondence accumulated alongside material items. Letters from her husband George VI, daughters Elizabeth and Margaret, and international dignitaries documented both private affection and political alliances. Each piece provided context for personal and national history. Even ceremonial objects received careful attention. Objects tied to coronations, royal tours, or public appearances were kept as tangible reminders of service and tradition. The Queen Mother's hoarding was rooted in memory and continuity, blending practicality with devotion, creating a life preserved in objects as much as in memory. Number 28. Prince Andrew of Greece. The prince who moved his life in trunks. Prince Andrew's hoarding emerged from exile and uncertainty. After the Greek monarchy fell in the 1920s, he transported trunks filled with personal belongings, ceremonial items, and family mementos across Europe. Each object represented continuity, identity, and aristocratic status in a life uprooted. Clothing, insignia, and medals were preserved despite frequent moves, often travelling with him on trains or ships. Ceremonial and military items validated his royal rank and career, creating portable symbols of authority. Correspondence and photographs accumulated alongside objects, maintaining links with family, European courts, and political contacts. Letters offered reassurance, practical advice, and reminders of lineage, while photographs preserved visual memory of people and places lost to exile. Every object, however small, became essential. Fans, silverware, and personal effects carried sentimental or symbolic value, reminding him of home and status. Prince Andrew's hoarding transformed ordinary trunks into repositories of identity, bridging the distance between past privileges and present uncertainty, and preserving a life defined by both heritage and displacement. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the fascinating and often surprising lives of British royals. From hidden collections to treasured mementos, we've explored how these monarchs and princes preserved not just objects, but pieces of their identity, memory, and history. If you enjoyed discovering these stories, please give this video a like to show your support. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the secret lives of royalty. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest videos and join our community as we uncover even more tales from behind palace walls.